A decade ago, following a U.S. decision to arm Syrian rebels, to which he opposed, Russian President Vladimir Putin was equivocally on the subject of cannibalism. According to him, he said, and I quote, "One does not really need to support the people who not only kill their enemies, but open up their bodies, eat their intestines, in front of the public and cameras," he said, likely responding to video footage of a rebel commander cutting the body of a fallen soldier and beating into one of his organs. "Are these the people you want to support?" he continued. "Is it them who you want to supply with weapons?" Now that the stance seems to have changed, not only has Russia revived the Stalin-era practice of throwing convicted murderers onto the battlefield to support its war in Ukraine, the so-called suicide squad includes at least 2 cannibals. The Kremlin has recruited tens of thousands of prisoners since the full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine began in February of 2022 to create its Putin'S squad, which are deployed to carry out highly attritional, infantry-led frontal assault at the most dangerous parts of the battlefield. Russian officials have never acknowledged creating Putin'S units with convict, and the Kremlin hasn't confirmed the total number of prisoners created by the now dissolved Wagner Group and Defense Ministry. However, Newsweek has learned that the total number of convicts who have been offered presidential pardon in exchange for 6 months fighting in Ukraine exceed 100,000, with 50,000 now free to walk the streets of Russia. A list of some of the prisoners recruited into the Russian military obtained by Newsweek revealed that men past retirement age are among them. The majority are convicts from the country's ethnic minority republics. Olga Romanova, the head of Russian Behind Bars, a charity advocating prisoners' rights, told Newsweek. This highlights what critics say is the dispensable nature of such soldiers, a sentiment with which even those serving on the front line appears to agree. Storm fighters, they are just mates. A Russian soldier who has fought alongside members of Putin'S told Reuters in October. The news agency said Putin's Putin'S units, each about 100 to 150 strong, combined pardoned victims and regular troops who face a disciplinary action, resentment of Joseph Stalin's Soviet panel battalions. One Russian mule blogger, cited by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, a US-based think tank, claimed that Putin'S assault detachment in Avdiivka direction in Ukraine's east and on Bakhmut's southern flank are often destroyed after a few days of active operations, losing on average between 40% to 70% of their personnel. The practice of recruiting in Russia's panel colonies began when the Kremlin was believed to be facing acute manpower shortages. Luring prisoners in with pardons from Putin and cash incentives has allowed Moscow to boast its manpower without mobilizing the young urban population, which could result in political repercussions. Among these recruits, however, are cannibals, murderers, rapists, and even a Satanist convicted of the ritualistic killing of 4 teenagers, of whom were eligible to be pardoned and released back into society. Murderers, rapists, and cannibals. At least 17 people who committed high-profile murders were issued pardon for fighting in Ukraine in 2022 and 2023, according to a Russian investigative site launched in 2021. The publication said all 17 took part in the war, and some have committed crimes against upon their return to Russia. Nikolai, a Russian man who confessed to being a member of Satanist sect and was sentenced to 2 decades in prison for killing 4 teenagers in a ritual, is among those pardoned by Putin. Nikolai was sentenced in July of 2010 on charges of murder, robbery, and desecrating a corpse. Members of the sect to which he belonged fried and ate their victims' organs at Nikolai's apartment in 2008, according to court documents cited by Russian publication 76.ru. He served for 6 months with a Putin'S unit, his father told the publication, adding that he returned from Ukraine on November 2nd and is currently living with his mother. Denis Gorin, another convicted murderer who killed at least 4 people and ate the flesh of one of his victims, is also believed to have been pardoned by Putin for fighting in Ukraine. Gorin, 44, from Aniva in the Far East region, was convicted of murder 3 times, the first coming in 2003. 7 years later, he was released on parole during which he fatally stabbed the brother of the man with whom he was in pre-trial detention. Investigators said he admitted cutting the legs off the man's corpse. He then washed them, put them in a refrigerator and ate them, according to a news outlet aligned with Radio Free Europe. Among other criminals pardoned by Putin is Anton Bochin, a resident of the Perm region who raped and killed 23-year-old Tatiana Rukitina last year. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison in February of 2023 and was freed to fight in Ukraine in August. By November, he had returned to his hometown. Dmitry Zelensky, who was sentenced to 11 years in prison for strangling his 27-year-old girlfriend, Tatiana Milikina, and putting her body through a meat grinder, was also pardoned this summer after fighting in Ukraine. The system has faced controversy even within Russia, however. The Kremlin was forced to respond to backlash over the case of Władysław Kaius, who have been convicted of the murder of his 23-year-old ex-girlfriend. Kaius was sentenced in July of 2022 to 17 years in maximum security prison over the killing of Vera in 2020. When I was cutting her, I did not like that she was screaming. I wanted her to shut up, Kaius told the court last July. Court records shows that Vera had 111 stab wounds, including some on her face. Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, told reporters on November 11 that pardoned victims have not escaped punishment, but instead atoned with blood for crimes on the battlefield, in assault brigades, under bullets, under shells. The Russian leader himself admitted that convicts have been deployed to the front lines. They gave their lives for the motherland and have fully absolved themselves of their guilt, he said in September. Human Waste Assaults in Russia. Neil Melvin, Director of International Security Studies at British Defense and Security think tank, the Royal United States Institute, said Putin has resorted to expanding his military's ranks from prison to avoid ordering a deeply unpopular mass mobilization ahead of the country's 2024 presidential elections. Putin is expected to announce his bid for another term as president soon, following constitutional changes made prior to the war in Ukraine. He may remain in power until 2036. While there is no danger that Putin would not only be re-elected by substantial margin, the Kremlin is anxious to avoid the elections becoming the focus for this content or even protests about the war, Melvin told Newsweek. For that reason, Russia is holding off from conducting a large mobilization that might touch the families in large cities in European Russia, and instead looking for recruits from places on the periphery of the country, from amidst national minorities and especially from prisoners, he said. Russian convicts have been the main source of the country's army's human wave assault. Over the past year, he added that those who survived are pardoned and released back to society, but that these often result in high rates of reoffending, especially having endured the traumas of the front and psychological stress this creates. Melvin noted that Russia looked to prisoners' labor as a source of troops during the Stalin wars, when the camps contained mostly political prisoners and the repressed prisoners were emptied to send soldiers to the front line, he said. The Russian military fighters with little regards to casualties, throwing troops into battle and then bringing in fresh units to replace those destroyed, relying on the country's large population and with little regards to life, Melvin added. For this kind of warfare, prisoners are viewed by Russian leadership as a resource that can be used with little risk of major political consequences. Viktor Kovalenko, a former Ukrainian soldier and journalist, told Newsweek that the armed forces of Ukraine does not allow enlisting criminals from prison. But for Vladimir Putin's government, there's no difference between who holds the rifle and who sits in the trenches. This is a unique Russian way to fight wars since Joseph Stalin and the World War II. Putin's regime resembles the brutality and immorality of Stalin's Soviet Union in many ways, he said. Kovalenko added, the recruitment of criminals allowed Putin to put Russian society away from thoughts about the unrest that would be the case if he would announce mass mobilization. The price for ordinary Russians, however, is to have those criminals walking free among them once again.